I chose the following artifacts to represent the Great Depression and the Roaring Twenties. The first artifact I chose was sliced bread. In 1912, Otto Rohwedder invented the first bread slicer, but he didn't like his idea. Determined that he could improve his invention, he kept working. Bakers in the area told him that the bread would go stale if it was pre-sliced. With his insight, Rohwedder had a novel idea. He continued to slice the bread, but then have it wrapped quickly in wax paper to keep it fresh. Unfortunately, bakers were still stubborn and did not take interest. Rohwedder persisted with his invention, taking it to the streets to prove interest. It wasn't until many years later that Frank Bench, a baker, finally took a risk and used Rohwedder's invention. The first loaf of pre-sliced bread came from the production of July 7th, 1928. Sales quickly skyrocketed, and in 1930, Wonder Bread officially started offering sliced bread. The next artifact I chose is the average week's pay for $17 in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a massive global economic recession, or better termed, depression. This downturn lasted from 1929 to 1937. This time began with the stock market crash of 1929 and the collapse of the gold standard. The term depression was given to this hard time because it was the largest sustained decline in the industrial production and productivity. And where there is a decline in production, there is a decline in jobs. Jobs became hard to find, and the jobs that were available paid less than they paid before 1929. Unemployment of the Depression was 24%. The average manufacturing job in 1929 was $27.36 a week. By 1932, those same jobs paid $18.18 a week, citing a decline of most 34%. In fact, the average job during the climax of the Great Depression paid a pitiful $17 a week. Hard to understand how anyone made it when you could consider the average rent for one-bedroom apartment was $18 a month. The next artifact I chose was the zipper. The 1920s would not be the same without the perfected invention of the zipper. By 1920, the zipper had already been around in one form or another. In 1893, a transition from clasps to hooks and eyes took place in garments. There is a series of loops were manually laced into boots or shoes as a continuation of clothers. It took an engineer, Gideon Sunblack, to recreate these previous attempts by devising a model called the Placo fastener. Unfortunately, this version provided little flexibility. In 1913, Sunblack revised his design and created a series of interlocking oval scoops instead of hooks that joined together by a slider. This final design is recognized as a modern zipper. Originally used for boots and tobacco pouches, the world of fashion was slow to take notice. It was B.F. Goldrich who used the production for boots and galoshes and gave the device the name the zipper for the sound zip the slider made. Next artifact I chose was penicillin. In 1929, bacteriologist Alexander Fleming found that mold had covered one of his bacteria experiments. Surprisingly, he found this mold could kill bacteria. In 1929, he published a paper about his discovery, which he called penicillin. Unfortunately, America was still in the Great Depression and did not take note. It was very hard to get funding for any of his research in those days, and with little interest at a great cost of time, he did not pursue his discovery. After years of problems with funding and no one else working on his discovery, someone finally inquired. Howard Florey read his paper on penicillin. 2 months later, Florey and his team began testing the mold on mice. With success, they tested it on humans with equal success. Deemed the miracle drug by next artifact I chose was an apple worth 5 cents. When my grandmother speaks of the Great Depression, she tells a story of her father taking to the streets of New York and selling apples to support her family. The very shoes on my feet were bought by selling apples, she says. In 1929 and 1930, the apple growers of Washington and Oregon grew more apples than they could sell. A brilliant man by the name of Joseph Sicker of the International Apple Shippers and Association had an idea. Sicker thought that he could turn the extra apples into a way of the unemployed making some money. An unemployed person of the time could buy a crate of 100 apples for $2 and sell the apples for 5 cents apiece, making a profit of $3 a crate. In 1930, 4,000 apple sellers took to the streets of New York City alone. By 1932, few apple sellers were left, but in the words of my grandmother, thank God for a few apples. The next artifact I chose was a Coca-Cola bottle. In 1886, the world of Coca-Cola was born. Pharmacist Dr. John Pemberton wanted to create a different tasting soft drink to be sold at soda fountains. By 1888, his dark drink was the number one selling soda at fountains worldwide. As interest grew, Coca-Cola needed to be bottled and sold. With imitators and competitors, Coke needed a special bottle designed to distinguish itself as the original Coca-Cola. By 1916, bottlers approved of a uniquely contoured bottle. It was so different in design that it could be recognized in the dark. This alone set Coke apart from everyone else. Mass production was initiated, and 1,000 bottling plants began producing Coke to be sent out the world. By 1820, Coca-Cola was a household name, and its unique bottle was much a part of the interest at Coke as the Coke inside. The next artifact I chose was a jarred sand to symbolize the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl came to be during the 1930s. It was coined this name for great amounts of dirt that began to blow, all the way from the southern plains to the east coast and beyond. The southern plains are made up of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, and represent more than 100 million acres of land. The Dust Bowl was thought to be created by several things: the combination of natural drought, high temperatures, and poor farming habits literally create a dust bowl. In the 1930s, strong winds, drought, and clouds of dust plagued nearly 75% of the United States. Farmers of these regions tried new merchandise farming techniques or plow-based farming as a way to increase profits. Unfortunately, this created a loss of fertile topsoil that literally blew away in the winds, leaving the land vulnerable to dirt and unable to grow crops. In the weird twist of fate, the rains stopped and the winds began to blow, creating black blizzards and dust storms. The next artifact I chose was a Band-Aid. Earl Dixon worked as a cotton buyer for Johnson & Johnson Company. Earl was married to Josephine, and as the story goes, she was very accident-prone. In the first week that they were married, Josephine cut herself with a kitchen knife twice. In the months that followed, it seemed to Earl that Josephine was cutting herself multiple times per week. Out of frustration, Earl took some tape and gauze and fashioned the first Band-Aid in his kitchen in 1920. At first, Earl took a roll of tape and placed squares of cotton gauze at intervals along the tape. If she cut herself again, all Josephine had to do was cut off the length needed and place it on her cut. Soon Johnson & Johnson heard of this and began mass production of Band-Aids in 1924. Eventually, Band-Aids would lead the way to sterile Band-Aids to be used in hospitals and clinics. By 1942, millions of Band-Aids were being shipped overseas to help with the war.